This is Pulse 95.
Pulse 95.
It's the Morning Majlis. It's the Morning Majlis.
Yes, it's the Morning Majlis. Welcome back onto the show. We have a lot to discuss this hour. In particular, right now, we'll be discussing travel rules and easing of restrictions in general. The UAE eased COVID-19 safety protocols just last week, scrapping the need for vaccinated inbound travelers to submit their PCR test prior to their departure. So there are many other countries, too, that have eased rules for passengers, but they still require them to carry a negative PCR test prior to the departure. So we have the latest guidelines published on the Emirates Airline website for PCR test requirements for travelers from the UAE to some of the popular destinations the UAE residents they basically travel to.
Yes, indeed. And looking further into this as well, in the countries that are listed, India specifically, some Indian airlines had announced that passengers who are fully vaccinated in India, they're not going to need a COVID-19 PCR test to travel from that country to the United Arab Emirates. However, according to Fly Emirates, all passengers from the UAE to India must present a negative COVID-19 PCR test taken within 72 hours before travel or a vaccination certificate. While passengers are subject to random testing upon their arrival on the airport, passengers chosen for testing will have to submit the samples and be allowed to leave the airport. Passengers who test positive are going to be treated/isolated as per the guidelines, while children below the age of 5 are exempt from both pre-departure and on-arrival tests. So that's India. But when it comes to Pakistan, that country also dropped the requirement for vaccinated passengers to carry a negative PCR test just a few days ago. However, those passengers who are not fully vaccinated, they have to have a negative PCR test before leaving to Pakistan. And then it shouldn't be taken more than 72 hours before departure. Passengers below the age of 12 are exempt from the vaccination, while passengers between age of 12 to 18 are allowed to go to Pakistan without vaccination, and that is valid until March 31st, 2022.
And there's all other countries such as Saudi Arabia, for example. If we were to look regionally, they say that all passengers except children below the age of 8 are required to present a COVID-19 PCR or an antigen test result taken no more than 48 hours before the scheduled departure to the kingdom. However, vaccinated non-Saudi travelers must present their proof that they've received the required doses and registered their data using online applications such as the Tawakkalna app. And if you were thinking of going over to Oman, all passengers arriving in Oman must present a negative PCR test, and the test should also be conducted within 96 hours before the scheduled arrival into Oman as well. For a shorter stay, I think it is about 72 hours for shorter flights, or a duration of 8 hours and less if you were transiting over there. But that's one of the requirements. But good news is that in the United Arab Emirates, to return, if you're a vaccinated passenger and a resident, you don't need to present a PCR test when you are returning back from your holiday. So that's great because, I traveled during the pandemic, and I remember that, let's say, when I went to Switzerland or even in Greece, we had to present a passenger locator form, where you're staying, declare your vaccination status for both countries. And when you're boarding a flight, let's say between Europe as well, they asked for a different passenger locator form for a different country. So a lot of paperwork was there back then. But now things are looking very, very easy. And for me to return, I had to spend €150 on a PCR test to return back to the UAE. But but one person who's now traveled during the eased restrictions, it is
myself.
Is Air Rania. Rania travels. So you ventured off to somewhere in the Mediterranean.
Yes, I ventured off to Tunisia.
Oh.
Yes, and it was a beautiful trip. It was much needed, and I enjoyed myself. The good thing is that when I got back, I did not need a PCR test when entering. When I went into the airport, I said, where do I do the PCR test? Because I know it's still not into effect yet. To be honest, right? I think it's going to be effective 1st of March, right?
Effective 1st of March is the masks. I think 25th of February effective was the travel eased restrictions.
Oh, that explains it. Yeah, because when I got back, I said, or do I need a PCR test in the airport? And they said no.
Wow,
that's it.
amazing,
So that was
isn't it?
like,
Where'd you go in Tunisia? Because I'm looking at places. There's a place called Sidi Bou Said.
that is the most beautiful place.
You've been there, right?
Oh yes, definitely. That was
Goodness.
like on my list, and I've seen it.
It's gorgeous.
and it looks like what does it look like? Mykonos.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
like
wow.
white buildings.
White and blue.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
By
I
the
love
sea.
the culture of Tunisia. I loved the travel off there. It's a mix of everything because they were colonized by the French and they were
Yeah.
colonized by the Romans, and at one point, of course, in time, Phoenicians and the Arabs and everything. So basically, you'll see the mix of cultures in their culture, in their country,
Wow.
and you can tell that they were colonized not only by the French but by the Ottomans and by everyone. So you'll see a mix of cultures in one country, and that is something that is spectacular about Tunisia itself. And you'll see that in their cities, in their different cities, because I ventured off, for example, to Sidi Bou Said. It looks totally different than Carthage, for example, or Carthage.
Yeah.
It's amazing, and they're known for their amphitheaters as well.
Wow,
very
So
cool.
I've went to their Roman-inspired amphitheaters. So that was something that I loved. I loved their culture. I love the people. The people there are so kind, so welcoming. It was. But the one thing that I actually had trouble with, to be honest, was the language.
Really?
There was a language barrier, even though they speak Arabic. But for me personally, I find it difficult to understand. So there was kind of I don't speak French, and of course they speak French a lot of the time. They mix between Tunisian Arabic and French.
Okay.
But I don't
Did
understand.
they have a hard
neither.
time understanding you?
Yes,
Oh,
a little
wow.
bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I made it.
You did, Rania. We're proud of you as well.
Yes.
Well, one more question. Tunisian food. Any recommendations?
Do they eat fish?
They eat a lot of fish.
Eat a lot of fish.
Yeah.
There you go. Stay tuned to Pulse 95. We've got many more stories to discuss on this morning's program. Up next, we're going to be talking about the major world development, the situation in Ukraine. We'll also clarify the UAE stance and so much more right here on Pulse 95.